I'm Matt McClure, and this is Currents. Is the military operation in Libya a just war or war at all? We'll find out. Plus, it's a book you won't find in the Bible. I'll talk to the author of The Gospel According to Bob Dylan. And looking for a home. A local exhibit explores the ouster of a religious community in New Mexico.
I think what is so moving about this work is what we give up for faith. This idea of being not attached to the material world.
Well, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. As fighting continues in Libya, there's word that Muammar Gaddafi could face charges of crimes against humanity. The prosecutor for the International Criminal Court said today he is 100% certain that an investigation into attacks on anti-Gaddafi protesters in Libya would lead to such charges against the regime. Meantime, there's disagreement in Washington over whether or not President Obama exceeded his authority by sending U.S. warplanes into action to enforce a UN no-fly zone. Jim Acosta reports on why lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are unhappy with the decision.
Thank you very much, everybody. Let's get to work.
When Senator Barack Obama launched his campaign for the White House, he promised to end the war in Iraq, calling the conflict a tragic mistake.
No amount of American lives can resolve the political disagreement that lies at the heart of someone else's civil war.
4 years later, President Obama launched airstrikes in the middle of a civil war in Libya to enforce a no-fly zone authorized by the United Nations. Now it's Mr. Obama's use of force that's at issue in Congress.
The president exceeded his authority, and it's very clear what to do about it: cut off funds for Libya.
From liberal anti-war Democrat Dennis Kucinich to Tea Party favorite Republican Jason Chaffetz, a growing number of lawmakers across the political spectrum are asking whether the president overstepped his constitutional authority.
I just see no clear and present danger in the United States of America. Consequently, I just don't think we should have injected ourselves.
Opponents of the president's use of force point to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that states Congress shall have the power to declare war. But Mr. Obama supporters note the 1973 War Powers Resolution, which allows presidents to take military action as long as Congress is notified within 48 hours.
The reason this happens is because presidents have found willing members of Congress that want to avoid responsibility. These are the same members that voted on the resolution of the Iraq War and later said that's really not what we meant.
On Monday, President Obama sent a letter to congressional leaders stating he was exercising his constitutional authority in Libya as commander-in-chief.
We can stand up to and stop ethnic cleansing.
The White House says it's no different from President Clinton's decision in the 90s to bomb the Serbs to stop a humanitarian crisis in Bosnia.
He did not have a congressional authorization, but he did provide a letter consistent with the War Powers Act.
Well, that report from CNN's Jim Acosta. Now, all of this debate leads to the question of whether or not the U.S. and coalition forces are justified in becoming involved in Libya. It's not an easy question to answer for sure, so we decided to consult an expert on the concept of just war from a Catholic perspective. Earlier, I had a chance to speak by phone with Father John Langen, a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. Father John, thanks so much for joining us here today on Currents. We really appreciate your time, sir.
Happy to be here.
Well, first of all, as we begin, give us just a little bit of a refresher course on exactly what is a just war.
Well, a just war is a war that's undertaken for a just cause, that is in response to some serious evil, genocide, major violations of international law, aggression. It's undertaken with good intentions, not out of revenge or anything like that, and it's got waged by proper authority. And then there's some other more specific considerations.
Sure.
Some chance, a reasonable chance of success, and that I think forces us to the further question about what counts as success.
Sure.
Since success is not simply prevailing on the battlefield.
Right. And that's something, I think that's a question, I think, politically that's been asked, what would be success in this particular case as well. And that's what we can get to that in just a sec. But in your view, does the conflict right now that's going on in Libya, does it fit in with the definition of a just war?
It's a very rough fit. I mean, I think there are good intentions, the desire to rescue people whose lives are at risk, but we are, in effect, marching into somebody else's civil war.
Sure.
And that's not really something that's altogether accepted as a sufficient just cause, because we ourselves are not under attack.
Sure.
Which would solve the just cause question.
Right. Well, and you know, of course, the point here is that they say, you know, that the going into Libya and any military action taken in Libya by you know, U.S. and other allies is to stop Muammar Gaddafi from attacking his own people, using military force against his own people. But then you have those other people who are, you know, also armed, these rebel forces that have taken control of some cities in Libya. So then, you know, that becomes sort of a conflict with the whole just war thing. Now, does the fact that we are taking military action in Libya with the backing of allies in the United Nations, does that make any sort of difference here as far as, you know, maybe going in with proper authority, another one of the tenets of that that you mentioned?
Well, authority exists on two levels. There's the national authority, which isn't altogether clear in our case because Congress has not really been effectively consulted. And then international authority, and we have some kind of authorization now from the UN. Sure. And there's something to be said for the consensus of the neighbors and the countries that are concerned about this, but it's not. There's some case to be made for this, but it's not an airtight case.
Sure. Yeah, of course they're you know, getting the backing of some Arab League nations and things as well, trying to get a greater consensus for actually doing, you know, what they're doing here. Now, I mean, and there's even some dispute about, and we've kind of alluded to this throughout the conversation here, especially a moment ago when you said, you know, that there hadn't been really much consultation with Congress on this, if at all, as to whether or not we're even in a war or not. I mean, is it a war or is it just military action? How do we define that?
Well, I think we've set a goal of restraining Gaddafi from certain actions against his own people. We have not set as our goal removing Gaddafi from power. We think that would be a good thing, but I think that's going to be up to the Libyans themselves.
Sure. Well, so bottom line, you know, it's not an easy question to answer, but maybe borderline just war, you think?
Yeah, it's some kind of emergency action. And I don't think it's a full-scale war, but it's working in a gray area.
Sure. Yeah, it's not always so black and white. It's a complicated world. Well, Father John, thank you so much for taking some time out for us today. We really appreciate it, sir.
Okay, you're quite welcome.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Well, on a side note, the Vatican's newspaper this week criticized France for being too hasty in taking action against Muammar Gaddafi. Reports say the paper, the Roman Observer, has also been critical of France for not showing a willingness to turn over command of the operation to NATO. Well, there's much more currents coming up, so stay tuned. New worries in Japan after the earthquake, tsunami, and radiation scare. We'll have that story, plus the rest of the day's headlines, next. Welcome back to Currents. I'm Matt McClure. Coming up later, forced from their home, the story of one religious community in a unique setting. But first, let's have a look at today's headlines. Well, after Japan's devastating earthquake and tsunami, as well as the lingering nuclear scare, now residents in the hardest hit areas have something else to contend with, a very new challenge to them: disease. Father Daisuke Narui, the executive director of Caritas Japan, tells Vatican Radio that evacuation centers there have no hot water, gas, or showers, and people are getting the flu. He says doctors are afraid of epidemics because of the unclean conditions. Meantime, the death toll in Japan is now at 9,800, with more than 17,500 people still missing. Well, the violence continues in Pakistan, this time in the town of Hyderabad, where a group of Muslims fatally gunned down 2 Christians and wounded 2 others outside a church. A report by the website Asian News says the Muslims gathered outside the church, blasted loud music, and harassed women trying to get inside. After being confronted by 4 Christian men, they left, returned with guns, and opened fire. This comes just weeks after the assassination of Shahbaz Bhatti, a Catholic Pakistani government official who favored overturning the country's blasphemy laws. Now, in a related story, the Vatican news agency Fidesz reporting that Bhatti's brother, Paul Bhatti, has been appointed a special advisor for Pakistan's religious minorities. Well, back here in this country, for the second time this month, a congressional committee will hold hearings to examine Muslims in the U.S., but with a much different focus this time around. A Senate Judiciary Subcommittee will look at ways to protect the rights of American Muslims. Now, according to a press release from Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, the hearings will be held in response to a spike in anti-Muslim bigotry, including Quran burnings and restrictions on mosque construction. The hearings, which are scheduled for next Tuesday, come less than 3 weeks after the House Judiciary Committee examined the issue of radicalization of American Muslims. Well, turning now to California, where a federal appeals court says no to more same-sex marriages while it considers the constitutionality of Proposition 8, that is the state's ban on same-sex marriage. Supporters of same-sex marriage had requested an appeals court to place Prop 8 on hold. They're awaiting the state Supreme Court ruling on whether Prop 8 supporters have legal standing to defend it. Now, proponents of the measure are looking to overturn a district judge's ruling last year that declared Prop 8 unconstitutional. Well, now an update for you on baby Joseph. The website Life News reporting the boy who was at the center of a right-to-life dispute in Canada has now been baptized. Joseph, who suffers from a debilitating neurological disease, was transferred to the U.S. last week after Canadian doctors had ruled the boy was in a persistent vegetative state and should be removed from life support, that against his parents' wishes. The American group Priests for Life helped get the 1-year-old moved to a hospital in St. Louis, where he was given a tracheotomy. Now, although he is expected to die soon, his parents say the procedure will allow Joseph to be with his family in his final days. Westboro Baptist Church, the controversial church known for picketing funerals, has announced plans to protest at the funeral of Hollywood legend Elizabeth Taylor. According to published reports, the daughter of Westboro's founder announced the protest on her Twitter page. The church, which is not affiliated with any larger Baptist body, is best known for picketing the funerals of U.S. military personnel, claiming God is punishing America for its sins, which they say include the condoning of homosexuality. Now, Elizabeth Taylor died yesterday after battling congestive heart failure. She was 79 years old. She was best known for starring in films such as Cleopatra, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and National Velvet. She was known off the screen for her efforts to help victims of HIV and AIDS. Well, meantime, the man who was the very first national spelling bee champion has died. Frank Newhouser was 97 years old. He won the national spelling bee way back in 1925. Now, the word that earned him the victory, gladiolus. Newhouser was also a lifelong Catholic. Virginia's Arlington Catholic Herald, which did a feature on him back in 2008, reported that the faithful example set by his parents stayed with him for the rest of his life. Well, could religion one day go the way of the VCR? Well, a new study by the American Physical Society thinks so. According to the study, which analyzed census data, religion will be driven toward extinction in 9 Western-style democracies. Those include Canada, Ireland, and Australia. The study's lead author says in those countries, the number of people who identify as unaffiliated with any religion is on the rise. The U.S. did not make the list. That's because the census in the U.S. does not ask about a person's religion. And in what may come as a surprise to many, Catholics will be allowed to eat meat tomorrow. Now, although it is a Friday during Lent, it's also the Solemnity of the Annunciation. That's a celebration of the day the angel Gabriel announced to the Virgin Mary that she would be the mother of Jesus Christ. And the church provides an exception to abstaining from meat when a solemnity falls on a Friday during Lent. So eat up. Stay tuned. There's much more Currents coming up. Just ahead, music with a message. It's a look at the spirituality of one of America's most popular musicians. Welcome back. Well, if you open up your Bible to the first few books of the New Testament, you'll find the Gospels, and you'll find some familiar names. But one name you won't find, though, Bob Dylan. The legendary singer-songwriter may not be a disciple in the original sense of the word, but he does have a catalog of music that's reached biblical proportions, 34 studio albums and 13 live albums, to be exact. Dylan openly embraced his faith before Jesus walked with Kanye West or Run DMC announced that they were down with the king. Dylan was raised Jewish, but he embraced Christianity in the 1970s and the 1980s, a change that played itself out in his music. And a little over a year ago, the man who knocked on heaven's door joined the multitude of rock musicians who have released Christmas albums. Well, to talk about some of the deeper meanings behind Bob Dylan's music, I recently had a chance to speak with Michael Gilmore. He's a professor of New Testament and English literature at Providence College in Manitoba, Canada. And he's also the author of the book, The Gospel According to Bob Dylan, the old story for modern times. Michael, thanks so much for joining us here today on Currents. We appreciate your time, sir.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, I think our viewers are probably all familiar with the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but I don't really know anybody who might be familiar with the Gospel according to Bob Dylan. That might come as a surprise to some people, although, some people are, I guess, very familiar with sort of some spiritual undertones in the music. Tell our viewers about the book, if you will, and kind of what made you write it.
Well, the title comes from a long-running series with Westminster John Knox Press. So I inherited the phrase, the gospel according to, and they've been working for a number of years in covering major celebrities, and it was just natural fit that Bob Dylan would be included in their list. So a few years back, I wrote a book on Bob Dylan's use of the Bible. So they asked if there'd be a possibility of expanding on ideas in that book. So this one is in some ways an extension, but also it's quite a bit different than the earlier book.
Sure. Now, what got you interested in Bob Dylan? Were you always just a big fan of his music, kind of back even from the 60s on?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit later for me that I discovered Dylan's music maybe around 1980 or so, and that's where it began entirely as a fan's interest in the music. But a few years later, when I got into university, I began to think about Dylan. I was studying both religion and literature, so he was a perfect artist for me to be exploring, because his music includes both religious content, and quite often he's recognized for his poetic prowess. So the academic interest followed quite naturally on the constant listening that a fan would engage in.
Very nice. Well, what are some examples of some spiritual undertones in the music that folks might be familiar with?
Well, there's, I'd suggest that probably the most familiar language, and the spiritual language that we find, is drawn directly from the Bible. And it's just pulling examples out of the air, but thinking of maybe the song Highway 61 that most people know, where you have basically a retelling of the Abraham-Isaac story. A very, very strange one, admittedly, but God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, and so Dylan plays on that idea in the song. You have several other biblical characters that appear, like Judas and Jesus, that appear every now and again in the music. And quite often, God is just an abstract concept, is lurking in the background of the music as well. So you have songs that sort of embody the quest for spiritual meaning. Something like Grain of Sand, a song that probably many listeners would be aware of.
In the fury of the moment, I can see the master's hand. In every leaf that trembles, in every grain of sand.
Yeah, it's amazing, and you talked about the sort of poetic nature of all of this, and how just as a lyricist, he's just been amazing really throughout his career. Is there, because it is, I guess, so sort of poetic and artistic in nature, of course, all of this is an art, and there is an art to putting words together, but with Dylan in particular, is there a certain sort of subjectivity to it? I mean, do people sort of draw from their own life experiences approaching his music and then maybe draw their own conclusions because of just sort of the nature of the way he has always written music?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That his lyrics tend to be very ambiguous, and there's no clear systematic statement about God or any other topic that I can find in Dylan's music. But it does lend itself to that kind of subjective approach to meaning. And so some people who have a particular ideology or politics, political views that they want to find in the music, they seem to find it. And the same is true with religion. If people are looking for someone to express spiritual longing or spiritual need in some way, Dylan's music is expansive enough and profound enough that it seems to accommodate that. Sure. So I think a lot of when we talk about the gospel according to Bob Dylan, or a spiritual depth to his music, I think it's mostly what we tend to bring to it. Right. And part of that, I think, is we know in some ways we know very little about Bob Dylan's private views of religious topics, and I think that's natural and probably the best place to leave it. We don't necessarily need to know what he believes. We can still bring our questions and our longings to that music, and it becomes very. It serves our needs, whatever those needs happen to be.
Sure, and there's plenty that's there in the lyrics, as you said. So, well, very good. Well, Michael, thanks so much. Our time has come and gone, but thanks so much for joining us here today on Currents. Once again, the book is The Gospel According to Bob Dylan, and it's available now. Thank you so much for joining us here, Michael. We really appreciate your time.
You're most welcome.
Thanks. Well, The Gospel According to Bob Dylan is published by Westminster John Knox Press. It is available in bookstores everywhere. Stay tuned. There's much more Currents ahead. When we return, art on the altar. A Manhattan church looks at the plight of a religious community left without a home.
So it's sort of, that feels very, very personal and very of this world. But then there's also this larger faith that they were operating in that was all about letting go.
Well, finally tonight, it is estimated that 500,000 people in Japan have been left homeless by the magnitude 9.0 earthquake and tsunami that ravaged the country almost 2 weeks ago. And many watched as the powerful waters swept their homes and their livelihoods completely away. And although natural disasters like an earthquake or a tsunami are not everyday occurrences, being forced from your home is certainly a reality many people across the world and in our own communities are all too familiar with. The theme of being displaced or forced from home is the subject of Everything That Ought to Have Remained. It's a temporary art installation built in a vacant altar space at St. Paul the Apostle Church in Manhattan. It's the story of the removal of members of a Catholic religious order from their home on the grounds of a former military hospital in New Mexico.
A community of educators, Catholic brothers, had been living, teaching, and praying together. And the school had gone bankrupt, and they were all being forced out of their home. What she did was she spent time going through these spaces and documenting, taking photographs of the bedrooms and the simplicity of the rooms that they lived in. I think what is so moving about this work is what Lee is really showing us in terms of what we give up for faith. This idea of being not attached to the material world as almost like requisite for having faith in something greater than ourselves.
There's this kind of idea that, well, religious life, you pick up your bags and you move. But these are humans, human beings, and it was very sad and very difficult. So she developed a relationship with the brothers and got to know them personally. So this display is done with a lot of reverence, a lot of respect.
The people are missing. You know, it's not like you're watching people weeping as they're torn from their homes by U.S. Marshals. This is a kind of more of a mute witness to the fact that something heavy has happened, but it's not as explicit.
We are all connected to the places we inhabit, and those places are going to change, and we're going to change, and it's a process. Yes.
It's interesting because it is just this documentation of the spaces. It leaves very much to your imagination what exactly that experience for the people involved was. You know, how easy or how hard it was, how traumatic.
Is chronicling community. It's chronicling the friendship of these brothers. And one of the things I thought was most artistically striking to me was including the games, the Parcheesi set, the jigsaw puzzle, because those are the elements that made me feel, oh, this was a group of men who were seeking God in community.
She's trying to make something that is not only positive, but will evoke other people's thoughts and maybe prayers for them. And that's why it's in the location it's at, where it could actually serve as a working altar.
At the moment I'm talking to you, we are confronting thousands, tens of thousands of people in Japan who are homeless. And so the loss of a living space, I think, does speak to all of us.
When we look at these photos from Japan and we remember what happened in Haiti not that long ago, and in Southeast Asia before that with that first tsunami, the fragility of that is so precious.
What you have here is really a sense of death and dying, but also, you know, there's resurrection. I think this display, this beautiful thing, the beautiful installation in itself is a sign of resurrection. You know, telling our story is a sign of resurrection.
Very moving display there, and if you're actually interested in seeing that exhibit, it will be on display at the Church of St. Paul the Apostle, that is in Manhattan, and it will be there through April the 11th. Well, that is it for this edition of Currents. Now, coming up on tomorrow's show, it happened 100 years ago, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. We'll hear the miraculous story of one woman who actually survived it. Until then, though, be sure to check us out online at currentsny.net. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter. And also, if you have a question, maybe a comment or a story idea, email us, won't you? Our email address is dropusaline@currentsny.net. For all of us here at Currents, I'm Matt McClure. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great night.